Hello, welcome to Distant Echo, New Mexico Special Episode 6, The Witches of Abiquiu. We spent the last 3 episodes talking about what makes up witchcraft across the various cultures of New Mexico, the greater Southwest. This time I thought we'd talk about some specific witch crazes in New Mexico, one of which being the witch craze of the Pueblo of Abiquiu. Malcolm Ebright, in his book, The Witches of Abiquiu, the governor, the priest, the Genezario Indians, and the devil, claims that this was one of the last major witch crises in North America. First, let's set the stage. In 1754, Governor Velez Cachupin would establish the land grant of Abiquiu Pueblo, granting it to a group of Genezarios. As a reminder, a Genezario was a detribalized Native American, usually from the Plains tribes. Usually these people had been raised Christian by the Spanish, and had more in common with a Spaniard than with their tribes, although how Christian they actually were appears to have been surface level. But due to the Spanish caste system, they were still considered more Indian than Spaniard, and were a class apart from the Spanish. Furthermore, these pueblos were made up of Genezarios from various different tribal backgrounds, further muddling any combined identity they may have had. The Witches of Abiquiu explains this dilemma well. Quote, "This led to the existential quandary faced by Genezarios in the 1760s. They were not Spaniard because they were designated as an Indian pueblo, but neither were they typical Pueblo Indians because of their wellspring of Indian identity. Their ceremonies, their religious beliefs, and their religious shrines were from different cultures and were thoroughly repressed and destroyed by the Spanish officials." End quote. However, it was not all bad. Some Genezarios could leverage their position. Quote, "It is clear from her will that Juana Galvan Hurtado was a woman with one foot in the world of her father, the Spanish conquistador, and then the other foot in the Indian world of the Navajos and Zias. Two quite different cultures. A century later, Pedro Leon Lujan maintained a similar ambiguous connection between Utes and the Spanish citizens of Abiquiu. In both cases, the Indian contacts of these two entrepreneurial traders served to empower rather than marginalize them." End quote. The Abiquiu group specifically appears to be mostly comprised of people from Plains tribes and the Hopi, with some other pueblos mixed in. The Abiquiu grant of the 1750s was also unique, and that was the only land grant made exclusively to Genezario. Abiquiu was a difficult location to forge a living in. In the 1750s, it was located at the edge of the Spanish world, making it a target of the raiding that was endemic on the far reaches of the Spanish Empire. It seems like the site had been abandoned shortly before the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. After that, there were a few attempts in the 1700s, and the Spanish began to enter the area in force in the 1720s or 1730s. The Spanish also intensified conflicts between the tribes in the area by encouraging conflict and bringing Pueblo Indians on slave raids. These raids would also often be on the tribes the Spanish thought were responsible for other raids. This would lead to reprisals from those tribes in turn. In the 1740s, this would get so bad that the Spanish settlers at Ojo Caliente and Abiquiu would actually request permission to withdraw their settlements. Of the various nomadic or semi-nomadic tribes, the Comanches and Utes posed the greatest threat to the Spanish settlements in the area, and was always a headache for the government. Again, from the Witches of Abiquiu, quote, "The problem of expanding Spanish settlement in the face of resistance by indigenous tribes had preoccupied the viceregal government in Mexico City since the Pueblo Revolt. Yet there was a good deal of confusion within the Spanish government regarding how much accommodation between Christianity and native belief systems was acceptable. On the one hand, the viceroy ordered the destruction of all idols, temples of idols, and altars of false gods, as well as the prohibition of all native dances and ceremonies. Governor Velez Cachupin, on the other hand, made it a point to try and understand and permit native religious customs whenever possible. In 1754, Velez Cachupin left a set of recommendations for his successor, Marin del Valle, which included the following suggestion regarding the Comanches. Permit their familiarities and take part in their fun at suitable times. Sit down with them and command tobacco for them so that they may smoke, as is their custom." End quote. During periods of more intense raiding, the Spanish would be more lenient towards Pueblo religious practices, as Pueblo allies were critical to the defense of the colony. This mirrors what we have talked about already in the main narrative of the show. Governor Cachupin was integral to the effort of making the area more secure by securing alliances with the Plains tribes and maintaining relations with the Pueblo. This would continue through the first term of Governor Juan Batista de Anza. Another strategy the governor could leverage was to establish Genezario pueblos such as Abiquiu. These efforts did help stabilize the region, but future governors would fail to continue this success, leading to a situation Ebright described as, quote, "Near panic in the Abiquiu settlements was so palatable that it must be seen as one of the main contributing factors to the witchcraft outbreaks from 1750 to 1760. During his first term, Governor Velez Cachupin succeeded in bringing a semblance of calm to the agitated frontier communities such as Abiquiu. Yet from 1754 to 1762, period between Velez Cachupin's 2 terms as governor of New Mexico, new hostilities shattered that calm. This eruption of violence resulted in the main form of inept policies of 3 governors who served during that hiatus. Abiquiu again became a war zone." End quote. Clyde Cluckhorn, in his book Navajo Witchcraft, posited deprivation as one cause of witchcraft behavior. Paraphrase and build on it. Desperate people turn to the supernatural or other similar beliefs to help deal with their situation, like trying to eke out a living in a near-continuous war zone. This could be one reason the people of Abiquiu turned to witchcraft. Cachupin, who will come in and out of our story, was from a family prestigious enough to be mentioned in Don, has been mentioned as one of New Mexico's most effective Spanish governors. Another character who will be central to the story of the witchcraft trials of New Mexico is Father Toledo. He had previously served among the Acoma, Zuni, and Hopi. He had at least some prestigious family ties that probably allowed him to move in political circles. He had at various times had some rather heated encounters with Pueblo leaders, including once shoving a Hopi leader to the ground. One problem among the Franciscans serving in New Mexico is that they were often shuffled around from Pueblo to Pueblo. This made it extremely difficult for any one friar to learn the local language. The Spanish repeatedly blamed some of the slow pace of conversion to this language barrier. In 1756, Father Toledo's predecessor at Abiquiu, Father Ordonez, would die at Laguna. The reason given was witchcraft. Father Toledo himself would also face several witchcraft attacks during his 4 years of tenure at the Pueblo. Normally, witchcraft trials in New Mexico were handled by the governor. Depending on the time and the governor in question, even curanderos would fall under persecution. The main goal of all of these trials, of course, being to ensure orthodoxy to the Catholic. Finally, for the last of the background, let's summarize the religious situation with the following from the Witches of Abiquiu. Quote, New Mexico at mid-century was a world polarized between Spaniards and Indians and their mutually exclusive worldviews. Spaniards understood little of the indigenous worldview, rejecting most of it, except some healing and sorcery practices. Individual Spaniards found to be helpful. Likewise, the Indians found most of the Spanish worldview objectionable because it held little room for an autonomous and prosperous indigenous population. Indians were to be exploited, and they resisted exploitation and forced Christianization, with what may well have been their strongest weapons, sorcery and witchcraft. End quote. With the stage more or less set, let's launch into the witchcraft craze in Abiquiu. In 1760, Father Toledo would write the first of many petitions. The governor Capuchin would ignore this plea for help against what the friar saw as witchcraft, but this could have simply been just Pueblo dances or other religious ceremonies. Later in 1760, after Capuchin had been replaced by Martin del Valle, Father Toledo would try again. Most of the friar's complaints centered around a man called El Cojo, who, according to the friar, worshipped the devil. This may have truly just been about a power struggle between the two men, as El Cojo was the leader of a hunt society at the Pueblo. Father Toledo was also, like many other priests of his day, obsessed with two ideas that we've kind of talked about. He was obsessed with the devil's pact, and that secretly witches were running a school teaching devil worship to others. They were also able to get the answer of, the devil made me do it, from many Puebloans. But that was the answer that the Spanish wanted to hear when they made these accusations. How strong any Janizario's individual belief in the devil, or even Christianity, is shaky. It's hard to say overall whether they actually were converted or not. We do know that El Cojo was at least slightly Christianized. Quote, El Cojo has been Christianized to the extent that Father Toledo had heard his confession, allowed him to take communion. These rights were denied El Cojo after he appeared before the entire Pueblo and admitted his diabolical pact. End quote. The governor would have El Cojo put in stocks until he renounced his pact and turned over some witchcraft-related item. He would renounce the pact, but over several releases, he would not turn over the demanded item. El Cojo's act of resistance may have also emboldened others. Another supposed witch, called Vicente, was already trying to kill the friar with his witchcraft. His power struggle would force the friar to get the youths involved, hoping their witches might be able to overpower the witches of the Pueblo. However, it did not go to plan. With the aid of the evil eye, El Cojo was able to force the Ute witch to retreat before she would eventually die. Father Toledo would try to recruit a few other sorcerers to beat El Cojo, but most of these would also fail. According to Father Toledo, the whole witch coven that he was trying to root out of Abiquiu had all sorts of dastardly tools at their disposal, including toads and snakes to control, much like the satanic tools we've already talked about in our earlier episode on Hispanic witchcraft. Eventually, the friar was able to recruit a witch named Coquinillo to act as El Descubridor, who promised he would be able to capture El Cojo, if not as a human, then when the unrepentant witch was in the form of a cat. But overall, nothing would come of all this, and Father Toledo's pleas for aid would more or less be ignored until 1760. In 1763, a woman from the Pueblo would come to the alcalde, claim that Joaquinillo had bewitched her. This finally made some officials take the friar more seriously, and it would quickly become a full-blown witch craze, reminiscent of Salem. Those suspected of witchcraft were quickly pointing the fingers at each other. Most of the witches that Friar Toledo considered to be the principal witches of Abiquiu would get sent to Santa Fe, but overall they would get a light slap on the wrist. The Inquisition didn't really have much interest in persecuting witchcraft cases, something that may have actually led to the lower number of witch hunts seen in the Spanish world compared to other parts of Europe and their colonies. The Spanish had an active interest in maintaining the buffer community at Abiquiu, which may have also helped make these sentences more lenient. The types of accusations were wide, ranging from beads to provide luck with gambling or in love to outright witchcraft. There appears to have been several conflicting belief systems mingling in Abiquiu, some even bearing the imagery of Mesoamerica. Others were simply part of various indigenous faith systems with no witchcraft tied to them in the eyes of practicing. Some of these actions were also legitimate witchcraft. Shooting magic were also referred to as being used, as are some of the cures to this magic, like sucking it out of the shot object. To Father Toledo, though, every break from Catholic orthodoxy was clearly a fault of the devil, but it may have been something much simpler. The people of Abiquiu didn't want to be Christian and were going to continue practicing their belief. This is seen throughout the northern frontier of the Spanish Empire. From Ebright, quote, "Resistance to Christianization and unwillingness to surrender their traditional belief system moved other Indians to attack Catholic clergy in New Mexico and throughout the Southwest. In New Mexico, such attacks, often resulting in the death of the priest, were more frequent before the Pueblo Revolt. In California, attacks on the missions and attempts to poison the Franciscan priests continued into the late 18th and early 19th centuries. In a kind of circular, self-fulfilling prophecy, the Franciscans viewed native religious ceremonies as witchcraft, and the Indians used witchcraft against the Franciscans as a form of resistance to Christianization. But the devil wasn't done tormenting the poor priest and his flock. He would soon place a hex on the priest. The hardy friar, though, would put up a stout resistance as he attempted to find out which foul demon had taken root with his flock. Vicente would also try to attack the priest in the form of a wolf, but Toledo kept on, trying his best to uproot the evil weeds sprouting through Abiquiu. He could only triumph over the devil and demons beseeching his flock. They would leave their idolatrous ways behind and be saved. In the end, though, this hex placed on the priest would eventually be cured with the help of another form of witch, the curandera. These events weren't localized to Abiquiu either. During the craze, there would even be a few events taking place at Ojo Caliente. On Christmas in 1763, there would be a series of exorcisms at Abiquiu, despite the Inquisition having come out against the practice of exorcism. It would start during Mass on Christmas and continue for several days. Symptoms included fits and spasms among the women of the Pueblo. There were several cases of possession, according to Father Toledo. At first, they would be benign, but each subsequent case was worse than the last. In the end, it would culminate in him speaking Latin to the devil himself. By January 1764, there seemed to be no stopping the tide, and Father Toledo was beginning to exhaust himself with his effort. But he also lost interest with some of the lesser devils he was dealing with. But by the end of this ordeal, it appears that Father Toledo's stance on native practice and witchcraft were beginning to soften, although he would send soldiers to destroy holy sites in the area. After this, he would create another list of suspected witches. Those involved would expand this list to include people from all across New Spain. Many of the important witches from earlier would not make this list, though. Perhaps this is due to their roles as informants. Most of their testimonies, however, were really nothing burgers. Just enough detail to get the Spanish to bite, not enough to actually convict anyone. The governor had come to understand that arrests and legal action were no longer effective, so he created a junta of priests to come up with a solution. Initially, Father Toledo was excluded from the junta so that the members could have a more objective view of the evidence. While the exorcisms continued into February, the junta came back with their solution. Everything should be submitted to the Inquisition for their verdict. Any remaining idols should be destroyed, and native dances should be banned. The junta had learned that the dances were often held on Catholic holidays to compete with the Christian rite. Let's take a break here to take a look at what this craze really seems to have been. It looks like it was really just a resistance to Spanish attempts to completely eradicate indigenous beliefs among the Pueblo. In the end, though this would not amount to much, the Inquisition and greater Spanish government just didn't have any interest to persecute the witches. By 1766, the whole thing kind of died off on its own. Most of the witches accused would be given mild sentences. Ebright sums it up pretty nicely with this quote, "Yet compared to Salem, where 19 suspected witches were hanged and one was crushed to death, the punishment phase of the Abiquiu witchcraft proceedings was relatively benign. No one was hanged, as in Salem. No one was burned at the stake, as happened during the European witch craze. The repercussions of the Abiquiu witchcraft outbreak were comparatively mild. As a result of the Abiquiu witch craze, Father Toledo was chastened for his overzealous desire to confront the devil. Governor Velez Chupin was vindicated for a successful handling of the whole affair. The Janizarios themselves eventually became part of Spanish society, no longer marginalized, no longer set apart as neither Spanish nor Indian." End quote. Although not all of them were lenient sentences, such as one woman who was publicly humiliated. She was stripped to her waist in public, honeyed and feathered. I think that what we've described in this episode, though, is a very Spanish way of looking at events in the mid-1760s. Look at the language I used so far throughout this episode. The devil, the devil, the devil. Does that sound like Navajo witchcraft? Did I mention the use of corpse powder, incantations, shooting magic? Were we burying stuff under lightning-struck trees, like Apache witchcraft? While probably some of the Janizarios did have hatred towards Father Toledo. Were they saying the incantation under their breath 4 times? Were they walking around him multiple times to make the magic stronger? While some of the accusations described shooting magic, it's still chalked up to the devil as the source of their power. The indigenous communities of New Mexico don't get their power from the devil. They're taught ceremonies and sacrifice to target their own in-group with this power for their own selfish gain. Take their power and corrupt it with their intense hatred instead. Very briefly, we even mentioned how maybe it was misinterpreting some of their own indigenous ceremonies as witchcraft. And summarize the events of Abiquiu a little differently. A community beset on all sides by hostile peoples, made up of several different mixing cultural groups, pressed by the government they toiled under, decided to push back in the only way they could, using the supernatural to help them. They attacked their priests, disrupted the religious proceedings, and some may have appealed to the supernatural. This made the priests respond in the only ways training and upbringing prepared them for, to blame the devil and witches when it was simple fear that motivated people to turn to the supernatural. In the end, Father Toledo would not go on to much of note. He writes summing him up with, quote, "This historical record has little to say about Father Toledo after his presence at the center stage at Abiquiu, battling the devil in the winter of 1763 to 64, but he seems to have mellowed in the decade before his death. First, Father Toledo's own ailments were cured, not by prayer alone, although he would have believed this must have helped, by the assistance of a folk healer, or curandera. Such healers were among the individual defendants who got caught in the web of witchcraft accusations in Abiquiu. Contradiction must have softened the priest's ardor to eradicate all semblance of Indian culture and identity at Abiquiu. He would be briefly investigated by the Inquisition, but the Holy Office would cease the investigation upon his death in 1774. The reason I wanted to talk about the Abiquiu witchcraft craze was mainly because it brings us back to that central question that I've been trying to get throughout this research I did on witchcraft. What is witchcraft? To the Spanish, it could be interpreted as indigenous beliefs, as we saw. Is a Pueblo dance witchcraft? What about a Navajo ceremony and chant? And I think that definition is the best that I can come up with for witchcraft in the Southwest. It covers everything that we've seen so far. Again, is Navajo witchcraft only evil witchcraft when it's used against the in-group? Does that make it acceptable if I'm using it against a different group that is affected by witchcraft? To a Navajo, the answer might be yes, whereas to a 17th century Spaniard, the answer may be no. And so I think this story at Abiquiu kind of brings that all together. What we've been talking about. Witchcraft is what the individual decides it is. Did Father Toledo consider a curandera witchcraft? It seems like he did at least at first, but maybe after his ailments were cured, maybe not. But that's enough of me rambling about what witchcraft is. Outside of the Abiquiu witch craze, that wasn't really the last witch craze in America, let alone in New Mexico even. In 1878, the Navajo would have a witch purge of their own. Were led by Manuelito, they would kill.
If you enjoyed the show, please share it with your friends. Leave a review on your podcast app of choice if it lets you. Since I'm a Luddite and don't use social media, word of mouth and reviews are the only way the show spreads.
And furthermore,
we have a website located at
engineeringfire.org,
that's spelled E-N-G-I
continue into the 20th century. I think that's where we'll wrap things up with our discussion of witchcraft and our October special episodes,
where I have a link in the header for podcast resources, including pictures, companion posts, my bibliography, and the transcripts of each show. We have an email you can submit comments and questions to at michael@engineeringfire.org. The intro music is Desperados by Frank Schroeder and sourced from filmmusic.io. The outro music is NeoWestern from Kevin McLeod of Incompetech. Links to all things mentioned are present in the show notes and at the website. And thank you all so much for listening, and I will see you in the next episode.